This is the Panopticast. Conversations at the edge of freedom.
Kevin Carson stands as a pivotal figure in contemporary social theory, advocating for a radical overhaul of the economic and social systems governing our lives. At the heart of Carson's philosophy is the concept of low overhead living, which he champions as a means to liberate individuals from the clutches of wage slavery, social estrangement, and a life devoid of meaning within the impersonal and asymmetric realities of capitalism. He posits that by minimising our reliance on large centralized entities, be they corporate or governmental, we can reclaim a sense of purpose, community, and autonomy that current structures systematically erode. Carson's critique extends to the macroeconomic scale, where he envisions an economic system characterized by decentralized production, mutual aid, and cooperative enterprises. This framework, he argues, not only presents a more humane and equitable alternative to capitalism, but also promises greater efficiency and resilience. By reducing the economic footprint of production and distribution, society can achieve a more sustainable balance with the natural world, while also fostering innovation and adaptability within local and global markets. Central to Carson's analysis is the role of state institutions, which he sees as complicit in maintaining the status quo to the benefit of corporate interests at the expense of the public good. He meticulously documents how regulatory frameworks, legal systems, and financial policies are often manipulated to safeguard corporate power and wealth, further entrenching inequality and stifling genuine competition and innovation. Go.
Yeah, I think just to add further context to his ideas, because I guess some of that can just sound like, oh, we need more localism, we need things to be smaller. But yeah, I think the key point around his arguments around the way in which the state props that up. So, for example, he's against intellectual property rights, which he sees as a form of protectionism that's not actually favouring innovation, but is instead kind of supporting large-scale organisations and extractive forms of wealth extraction. Mm-hmm. Similarly, as he draws on kind of Lockean theories of property around mixing one's labour with with the soil or with whatever it is one's doing, that therefore legitimises property ownership. But things like absentee ownerism at a certain point become illegitimate. So forms of squatting, forms of repossessing buildings or land on the basis of kind of, again, these, buying up these limited resources and then using them as a way of, it's a form of rentier economy that, we face more and more now especially with platform capitalism. And then the other side.
Platform capitalism.
The fact that, especially say with social media, the internet.
Or platforms and media platforms.
Yeah, but the media platforms, but also ICT platforms. So, for example, I was listening to Yanis Varoufakis, who's a Greek finance minister, but writes, he's a professor as well, written several books, but he was talking about the way in which the German car manufacturing industry is in dire straits, because actually the material goods to produce cars and the kind of automated technologies for that are no longer the value added. It's about the computer systems and the software that are in them. So Gates's Microsoft is a classic.
Germany can't keep up as the industrial giants that they were, because now the platform
China and the US
more on microchips and whatever else,
including the AI, including and this is where the actual everything's becoming more digitalized, more based on platform. If you think about the Internet of Things and the way in which that'll intersect with cars and all the rest of it. So again, that's a huge monopoly that is just going to extract, the value added, and then the car manufacturing becomes almost equivalent to, the farms in the developing world in terms of, the primary goods.
Yeah, so what you call platform capitalism there, isn't that like a really big elephant in the room then? Because capitalism's going to get massive injection of more potency on that basis, because it's going to be worse than it's ever been on that basis. I've just never thought of it like that.
Yeah, Varoufakis' new.
All the negatives of capital, even coming from a capitalist perspective, the downsides of the inherently best system we've got, even if you wanted to do that, the downsides are about to get a lot worse because of the.
Yeah, so it's I mean, I was just going to say Varoufakis' new book, I think, is called something like neo-feudalism, or it's got that word in it, because the model is that there are the owners of, in that case, the land. But if we say now the digital space as being the new land, data is the new oil, as they say, the monopoly owners of that are essentially, doing no labour. They're simply extracting rents for the privilege of being able to access their systems.
Yeah.
So it's just it's a form of increase in rentier economy, and intellectual property is one of the major underpinnings of that.
Yeah.
So that's part of where it's coming from in terms of propping up this kind of artificial giganticism. And the other side of that coin is around the technological innovations that should have in fact led to increase in decentralization, if you look at it from purely the perspective of what would be most efficient without that kind of intervention and layers of protectionism. So
Electric's the big one, right?
Electric was the big one that it was saying should have moved from steam-powered mechanisation, which did inherently require, large-scale factories to maximise the gains from those, large-scale means of creating energy, to electricity, which should have favoured smaller-scale, more networked forms of cooperation. And I'll mention, Mondragon cooperatives just as a placeholder to come back to, but, the idea, and then once you add the internet onto that and the ability to coordinate at distance and the forms of network logistics that enables, as well as forms of network production, which people in what you might call the peer-to-peer movement were really focused on, growing out of the astonishing feats of producing software in these kind of collaborative commons, and then things like Wikipedia and other things, which what everyone thinks of them now, the actual logistics and the production, the mode of production, if you like, for that with decentralized peers was a further kind of infrastructure that should have pushed that model further. So there's the kind of technological aspect of it, and then there's if you like the kind of regulatory aspect of it.
So I'm right in thinking that what you're getting is, whether it's in the technological advancements and in the regulatory side of it, that the overlap or the sort of the commonality between them is when you've got entrenched systems, you've got an entrenched elite that has an infrastructure in place that is served well by the old way of being. Something new comes in that can localize and democratize and revolutionize it all. They've got a huge vested interest in keeping you operating within the system that they have the trains and the coal and all the infrastructure to maintain, right?
Yeah, and in fact what they've done is they've started essentially to exploit that peer-to-peer nature. So
just the elite in general,
let's say
influencers,
let's say
the global capitalist class.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, when essentially people are giving free labour instead, so they allow an element of commons, but they own the platform. So if you take something like Amazon, a big proportion of the value of that is through the peer-to-peer rating system. So people are rating different products and goods and services, and that then gives people confidence to buy them. So that would be an example of what Carson, one of the things Carson talks about in his book called The Desktop Regulatory State, which is that actually forms of regulation, especially in that case if they're about trust and credibility, if you like, for sellers. So you don't need to accredit them with some sort of professional guild, which would have been the old model. Actually, there's a decentralized way of doing that, which is where people that have engaged in those services within a platform can validate that. And now, again, I know these things aren't perfect, but just to illustrate the point. But instead, people are doing that. They're getting they're getting value in a sense, in the sense that that's helping others to choose. But it's ultimately Jeff Bezos and Amazon that are benefiting from that value. You could look at Uber, which is benefiting from the internet, from decentralized platforms, no doubt from a lot of open source software or free software that at least contributed to some of those systems. And but then that's extracting just from the ownership of that platform a lot of the wealth that actually, if those drivers were just federated in a commons, could be could be retaining the value themselves. Similarly with Airbnb, you name it. So all the work on Airbnb is done between the seller and the buyer, and the comments that they give and the rating system, etc.
Yeah.
But that again is being extracted by the company, and so this, I think this is across the board, and even with the shift from free software to open source software, where the latter allowed proprietary elements to be built into it, the corporate system, the transnational capital elites, were happy with allowing some of this to happen because it could mobilize
It's still an increase in efficiency.
It could mobilize that peer-to-peer like commons-based production, and then
in support of the previous system,
extract the maximum wealth from it. So I think, and Carson would argue, he's fundamentally against most, if not all, I think, intellectual property. It's that enforcement mechanism. It's the state's ability ultimately to threaten violence and so on within that allows that system to reproduce itself. And it's interesting you said about capitalism and apparently this best system. This is where you get debates, I guess, in what some would call market anarchism, whereby what is capitalism? If you read, for example, a guy called Ferdinand Braudel, who's a very famous, prominent historian, and I can't remember. He did a 3-part, 3 big chunky volumes on the history of the market and capitalism. The two are quite distinct. Capitalism's always been about capturing, controlling markets, capturing wealth, creating monopolies, interacting with the state. And the more, if you like, organic notion of a market, which is, the markets you see on the street where independent retailers bartering and trading, and then actually through that process finding a fair or natural price between, the effort and the labour versus what the buyer's willing to pay. There's a massive distinction between those two, and I think one of, Carson would talk about, I can't remember the term he uses, but he's basically saying a lot of these right-wing libertarians that claim to be about libertarian have so many kind of statist, protectionist elements, and it's actually therefore a complete ideology in that it's veiling a form of power, whereas drawing on some of the early market anarchists that came out of David Ricardo's kind of political economy analysis, we're actually rooted that in things like natural price and the fact that ultimately the market as they saw it would always push prices to what's called the marginal cost, so you would actually get a fair and free exchange. And what capitalism's always about doing is trying to create forms of protection that actually extract huge amounts of wealth. So the rentier economy that came from forms of feudalism and serfdom has consistently maintained itself, and now, like I say, with Varoufakis, with this neo-feudalism, Varoufakis is saying, well, capitalism is now transforming back into its highest apex into a form of feudalism, and it's even wrong to use the word capitalism now.
Is there something to like? Is that transformation because when you get the new technological developments and even just cultural developments in sort of intellectual sphere that make, say, something like the internet comes along and it could revolutionise, it could destabilise that old way, but then it gets usurped and incorporated in the way you're talking about. When stuff like that comes along, there's an appetite. People recognise it. You get the equivalent of the kind of the hacker class that know exactly how this could be utilised, and you get a movement saying this is revolutionary, and not just the fact that the sort of the sort of legacy system then incorporates it slowly, but there's an argument for how it would, in a chess sense, how it would have to, like the Amazon example is quite a good example, like with the incorporating the review logic, right? that there would be a prudence to the traditional system giving ground a little bit, because if this thing's got going too fast, it could be a revolution like this. So giving ground and allowing people to feel like these new advancements, look how they've affected our lives, look how much freedom we've got, look how much more like facility and exchange capacity it's introduced in my life, until the new technological advancement has been assimilated and it's understood by the prevailing order. So as soon as it's back on safe ground where it knows, wait a minute, this couldn't be mobilized against us in a revolutionary sense, as soon as that established order looks at the playing field and says, no, we're good, we've got this, everything's been sorted now, at that point it can go, okay, old feudalism, it can push back safely to the older, more highly efficient manifestations that it's had before. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It just seems logical. It just seems that's what you do. You would have to give ground as that previous higher principle authority that's got control over that situation. You would have to give some ground based on this new revolutionary sentiment. But as soon as everyone's assimilated it, and because of your monopoly on power and all the rest of it, you've assimilated it slightly better, you can push back a little bit and go, okay, enough of that. Let's get back to something a little bit more feudalistic, which seems to be what's happening.
I mean, I guess if you think about I'm not an expert on the history of the evolution of capitalism, but there's clearly at a certain point a conflict between the value system and the power apex, at least at a level. I mean, maybe not right at the top, but the landed gentry. You see the relics of that even in the UK. Where now in some cases, some of the progeny of these landed gentry can barely afford to keep the manor house, maintained and updated. And also there was a value system that tried to instill a notion of caste almost, that these people were born into privilege, had different manners and mores, and and at that time there was, I guess, for all sorts of reasons, including technological advancements at the time, probably in travel and shipping and so on, that probably merged with geopolitical aspects as well, but there was this ascendant merchant class that, from a values point of view, that landed gentry, they did have their own notions of virtue. The knights, there was a whole kind of language and history of ways of life and forms of virtue that they probably, not probably, for certain, saw this merchant class as money grubbers and, purely interested in commerce and so on. But I guess, if the state at a certain point, recognised that if you're going to remain competitive with other states, if this ascendant class here is able to generate much more wealth that will then support an economy, that will support a military, etc., etc. I mean, maybe we're slightly veering off, I guess, from Carson a little bit, but
it's relevant.
It's relevant because at the same time, many of those previous elites became the initial factory owners, became the ones that, for example, had the sheep farms that were so important to the enclosure of the commons.
So yeah. I was just going to say, so his analysis seems at least grounded in even I don't want to say limited by, but it's that's the boogeyman in the story is capitalism, or feudalism, and what gives rise to capitalism. So my question would be,
the state in that it creates a false economy that supports that's concentrated power.
That's pretty much answered my question. Because what I was going to say is, on reading him, and just if you were to listen to every interview available, I'm pretty sure that the story all starts, with I don't know, maybe he's done some work on the early states, kind of the what's he called? James C. Scott. Because it seems like that. It seems like I want to hear the conversation between James C. Scott and Kevin Carson, because I think it's you should be focused. It makes sense for it to be focused in on the modern manifestation of this problem, which arguably capitalism's a huge part of that. But I'm interested in the question of whether and you did partly answer it anyway, but whether that emerges at the first time, either one Homo sapien among his band of Homo sapiens, or one band of Homo sapiens versus another band of Homo sapiens, decide to impose. It's not the natural primate logic of hitting each other with whatever piece of technology we've got in that particular era in order to get access to the water and all or whatever. But as soon as it becomes about surplus, putting fences down and a state structure, as soon as you've got an elite, even if that's a one-person elite in a tribe, would he say then, that's what it goes back to? It goes back to the point at which you've got a surplus empowered elite, however small that happens to be, being able to impose the will kind of thing, because it's at that point it's not like there's a public-private sphere. You've got this, I would point back to that authority being where it all goes wrong kind of thing. But it seems like for his analysis, he's talking about these interactions, the interaction between the corporate sphere and the state. And if he solves the problems, I suppose this is what I'm getting at. Let's say everyone took Carson at his word, and we all just created a new system tomorrow on that basis. Would we still be left with the initial problem, which was, the sort of asymmetries, the information asymmetries that exist as soon as you've got an elite of any kind, even if it's just the king, the supposedly benign king, even, who can slowly amass that kind of influence over the people underneath him. Does his analysis question and seek to kind of challenge that part of it before there's a sort of a corporate sphere kind of thing? Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I don't think so, I'm pretty sure it's a while since I read his first book on mutualism, but I don't think he does that far back historical view. But certainly, I mean, his whole, he's an anarchist, so he's against political authority. And I think
it is all encompassing anyway.
And there's, people generally see the state in one of two ways, and obviously people recognise that it could, it's on a spectrum, I'm sure. But either as something that is holding back the worst impulses of private enterprise and capital accumulation, and redistributing to the population through forms of so let's just go to social democracy. That's what the state can do. Or even in those most sort of halcyon, idyllic days of when before, let's say, globalization and the ability that it gave to capital to essentially flee the restrictive constraints that a democratically elected state could place on it. It was still doing more to actually maintain the hegemony of capital accumulation, and that actually without the power of the state, those forms of concentrated wealth would very much evaporate. Yes, of course, there would be degrees of inequality, but actually those forms of inequality would be much less, because people would have I guess the major point is, without getting too lost in the weeds, is that does a regulatory environment actually do more to maintain forms of concentrated power than it does actually seek to control and limit those forms of concentrated power?
And it's surely about capture. And if you've got the MO of a Homo sapien that will grab that club and try to get authority via surplus or just the club over the people underneath them or whatever. And then as systems evolve, the kind of economic systems we're talking about evolve, even if that king remains just a simple human trying to batter other humans so he's got a bigger share of the pie and more access to the female Homo sapiens, even if that stays that simple, these systems manifest that even if they're seen to be holding in check, there's always going to be capture of the state the state infrastructure, however it's manifest, until it becomes, like you were saying, until it the at certain, during a certain window, there would be a kind of, you could see, and it gets pointed to a lot, you could see there'd be this counterbalance of forces that keep each other in check, but without showing a component that maintains that status quo, you're left with human psychology, which will push for more power, more influence, or whatever, and that leads to capture at multiple levels. So that over a long enough time frame, you can realistically say that the capture will become, the predominant sort of quality of the situation, and at that point you end up with the state in its traditional ways, or in its first initially emergent ways, becoming lesser represented, and these depersonalized, globalized, non-state based corporate entities existing, which is why we're seeing these arguably why we're seeing these signs towards technocracy and globalization and the rest of it.
Yeah, and I think that and the other thing I personally like about Carson, because at one point I think he probably associated with the term free market anarchism, but actually I think in the end he said anarchism without any prefix, and he spends a lot of his time also looking at what would be called the commons and forms of common and commons-based peer production. So commons-based peer production in the digital realm, which we've touched on and what overly labour, but also the work of people like Emily Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize of Economics for her work on common in the physical world, the sharing of resources amongst a bounded community, in which governance, if you like, takes place not through state-imposed regulations, nor through parceling everything out into individualised property rights and then, utilising contract and a legal system, but actually through other sets of norms and incentive structures and so on that enable people to share commons. So whether that be forests or forms of, other land, farm land, etc., etc. And then also, I guess, other forms of using voluntary association to create non-capitalist and non-market spaces. So, the use of trusts for land as well, so that people can share this resource, but keep it out of being able to be marketized at some point as a piece of private property, etc., etc., etc. So just to kind of really give the picture, he'll often utilize a lot of thinkers that are associated with, say, like the Back to the Land movement, small is beautiful, rescaling things for human level technology and human level use, along with the role for the market. So what you actually get is in his view that the natural, in inverted commas, without the forms of state intervention, would actually be much more plural. It would facilitate more decentralization, so there could be more experimentation in different ways of living and forms of governance that combined forms of common in, forms of market, etc. And that we're able to make use of the scale of technology to achieve that. More cooperatives probably, etc., etc. And I mentioned Mondragon as a good example of where
This is Italy.
This is Italy, where within the region, I think 1/3 of all production and consumption is done through a cooperative model,
with identifiable gains, like easily. As in for the realities of the people involved in it, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. The lack of the impact. Yeah, the lack of alienation that comes with that. The forms of communal ownership, the ways then that removes a kind of boss worker hierarchy, etc., etc.
Let's just say something about the low overhead stuff for a minute, because I think that's a really important.
True. Well, let's start with where we were in terms of a rentier economy, right? What is a rentier system? It's more and more placing unearned overheads. So you're paying the tithe to the landowner or the platform owner or the et cetera, et cetera. And like I said, a lot.
Interesting that's one of the bedrock principles of every old religion. That you can't do that. You can't. You can't just make money on interest.
Yeah, exactly, and that's important. Yeah, so the money on interest is one as well. So he would, Carson would be about local currencies, and I think there's threads of what would be called social credit movement logic, where actually the most important thing is for money is as a means of exchange, rather than as a store of well, it means to exchange to some extent a store of value, but not a kind of speculative asset in and of itself. Because once you get forms of rentier extraction, and this comes to a bigger point around the model of the global economy, then you get investment, more and more investment goes, what was 2008? And, the epicenter of it was the housing market, because speculative capital, was simply just inflating the prices of those assets. You get the kind of bubble that creates where more and more money goes into that. There's nothing productive about that. It's simply inflating rent for a class of wealth owners that is purely extractive on the sweat and back of people actually producing goods and services that people need. So if you accept and follow the argument that a huge amount of the modern economy is extractive, is rentier, that's a big proportion of your overheads. So there's that angle to it. And then the second angle to it is, by which I mean by smashing that system, by working around it, or potentially, removing the state's power to prop that up, you massively reduce overheads, and in line with the kind of socialist ethic of this, you reduce inequality, because classically with, Marxism, it's about these, these owners of capital that are able to constantly, in a positive feedback loop, expand their wealth on the back of ownership of capital. The other then angle around the...
I was just going to say, I think the interesting element is for the individual's lived experience of the low overhead lifestyle. And the benefits that it gets, the benefits it achieves in you being a part of an actual political. You're adding momentum to a political movement that is about as objectively sensible as you could possibly find, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But then also the immediate effects for your life, because it comes down to a definition of wealth as well, right?
Yeah.
If you were to live. You take people who are essentially would be considered wealthy, who are killing themselves in higher droves than anyone else, really, right? Don't get me wrong, the people at the very bottom, they're the worst off, but you're arguably a little bit better being a couple of notches up from the bottom than you are being here, in terms of where your values are, how estranged you are from family, and a sense of a tribe and all that sort of stuff. So the idea of wealth, you could put somebody in a small building only big enough to house their family on a small piece of land, living very simply, looking poor by the normal metrics we apply. But actually, if you go and talk to those people, you'll find they're quite often a lot happier than other people are, because they're getting more, they are more centered on the family and sort of mutualism between the people in their environment and all the rest of it. So I think it's an important thing to recognize that he's offering a political answer, but it's not just, here's a grand idea of how we can revolutionize society. It's like this is the way you can improve your life more instantly. I'd make that bold statement. There is no way, after daily exercise and good nutrition, there is no way you will improve your happiness and your sense of value and purpose faster than you will instill in some of these ideas and applying them at that individual level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you can say as much as you want and more about the sort of psychological aspect, the benefits of that, the kind of well-being, but I just wanted to make the point that people might feel it's unrealistic, but you've got to recognize, I mean, David Graeber wrote a great book called Bullshit Jobs. You've got to recognize how much, what was the dream, what was the dream that was presented to people around the dynamism of quote unquote capitalism, right? It was that it would continuously, revolutionize the means of production so that we, increase efficiencies. For what benefit? the benefit surely should be to expand the realm of freedom that human beings live in. And if need is
if you're measuring benefit that way, if that's what you're shooting for.
Well, indeed, but
individual benefit, not species-wide efficiency for maximised technological advancement.
Yeah, but the efficiency and technological advancement was, should and can be about, freeing up human time, right? And there's an inverse relationship between...
And genius thereby.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and so there's an inverse relationship between time spent on need, which in a sense is a form of slavery to your own biological system. I mean, you don't have to look at it like that, but it's like, I have no choice but to do this in order to reproduce.
Which has always existed, even if you just go and throw in a spear at an animal for an hour a day, 2 hours a day, 5 hours a day, whatever.
Yeah, but probably more likely 2 hours a day, right? And that's the point in a way. So when us moderns, look at some of those historical cultures and and you look at how healthy they were, and you look at, there is a degree of nostalgia for that, noble savage, or however you want to put it, and I think what Carson's saying is, well, what this system, so long as it maintains this elite class, does is parasitic, and it produces extraction. Actually, we could live a low overhead life, benefiting from the advantages of the technological tools that make things more efficient, so that actually we should only, we could and should only be working, 2 hours a day or 1 or 2 days a week. Now this, and in terms of that, you can speak more about the psychological, but in terms of the sense of autonomy, sovereignty, agency within that space, that's you achieving that through taking advantage of all the sweat, blood and tears of our predecessors, and all the benefits from knowledge and technological advantages, when at a human scale, therefore there's less alienation, because we're not a tool of the machine, if you like, but we are agency in utilising those tools, albeit in very magical and amazing ways that those tools now enable. Yeah. But there's a shift in quantity around that is qualitative in effect. Whether you're an appendage to a massive machinery.
It's funny, it stands to reason, right? Like a 12-year-old kid can understand the logic that if you're going to orchestrate essentially a global economic system now, around it being the most efficient machine it can be, well, there are going to be some really miserable tiny cogs in that machine. And it's not an analogy, right? Like if an individual needs a broad range of experience to be happy for what their benefits are. But if you want, don't get me wrong, if they said there's a meteor coming, it's going to crash into us in 50 years and we need to get off the planet, I'd become almost a fascist overnight. We need to mobilize every human being on this planet, and we're just going to have to take the bullet, and all that matters is the efficiency of the system. If it was
that's the war logic, and it's similar to the kind
and then you can see that's what validates and justifies a lot of their thinking. If the objective, and this also gets into the biopolitical stuff we've talked about before, that is the objective survival? If a meteor was coming in 80 years, would it actually be better to just, I guess this is the natural order of things, and let's keep hugging our kids and watching those sunrise? And it's a philosophical point. You can argue it both ways. I would say if there's an impending threat, it's the meteor is another barbarian at the gates, right? If a meteor was going to come and do that, you could argue that we should, if you are more effective as a small cog in this machine, well, look, this machine's going to save your grandchildren, so let's do it. Yeah. There's at least an argument there. But without that sort of knowledge, everyone would aim towards. This is probably why there's always an impending threat, in that way. And religion's done that forever. But not to get sidetracked. But generally speaking, day to day, people will say, well, what are my objectives? My kids' safety, my happiness, my nutrition. And as soon as you're in that zone, this small cog in the machine thing, no, not happening.
But just a bit of a corrective on that, though, because you used the word efficient at the start. I mean, Carson's whole point is that this system is not efficient, even by the terms of what market efficiency means. Yeah. Because market efficiency is constantly, should be bringing down price through competition. I mean, that's not even succeeding in its own terms. Pitch. It's not because, on his argument, in the collusion between corporate power and the state is constantly creating ways and means of producing various forms of oligopolistic, monopolistic, extractive rentier. Rent. If you read David Crowd, read Adam Smith, the classical political economists, saw rent as a means of inefficiency because no labour's been done, no productivity has been increased. It's simply extractive. It's simply extractive, and so so that's the link to the low overhead on the one side, but also the technological means that that enable. What I was going to say is, what you will read a lot of authors now who recognise the crisis of capitalism brought about by the shifts, and in particular the robotisation, artificial intelligence, the role of digital and the cognitive intellectual aspect of value production now. That has meant that the vast bulk of quote unquote value is not coming from matter. It's coming from the human collectivity's propensity for knowledge and technological advancement and so on. So you get in these forms of unemployability. I mean, there's always been technological unemployability, but the forms now seem to be becoming so radical in terms of AI being able to do so many different things, even up to the level of, say, like reasonably mid-level legal advice. Do you know what I mean? And
upper mid-level.
Yeah, exactly. And then so you name it, almost everything apart from the most emotional, effective form of labour, affect. And so what are the kind of solutions that have been talked about? Universal basic income, for example. That is the most, I would say, I mean, there's debates to be had on this, but it's a fundamentally state is centralising and alienating and also politically disempowering. Infantilizing and politically disempowering, because who gets to decide? And we're seeing this now with social welfare, where they're monitoring people's bank accounts and so on. Who, have you been a naughty person? Have you said something that's politically, okay, well, your universal basic income, and this is why people are concerned that it links to a sort of social credit system and so on. It maintains power. Whereas what Carson's saying is, you'd only have to work 1 or 2 days a week. There's your universal basic income. Do you know what I mean? They're seeing the same.
Doled out to you like
they're seeing the same problem, but the universal basic income is essentially a solution that maintains that rentier system, but recognises that, in a sense, capitalism's become, or feudalism's become so productive now with but roboticization, technology. But let's keep this extractive elite class that can continue to create the benefits of that, and then let's somehow make sure that we can feed in this universal basic income. So you can see the different, and this comes to your point around the psychological stuff, you can see the different form of life between those two solutions to the same problem.
Form of life as in, you mean like the lived life of the individual?
Yeah, exactly. And or of the local, and the local community. It's not, for me, it's not just individual, and I don't think it is for Carson. This is why I think he moved from calling himself a market anarchist, even though he recognises a strong role for the market as he understands it, which is closer to the market that we visualise in the centre of the town or whatever. But with a recognition, like I said, that there's actually a space then for a pluralisation of institutional and governance forms, drawing on what people have written about the commons, and that actually when you leave things to themselves to some degree, those things do evolve, because people don't just want to be in market exchange, especially with a proximity of people, let's say in a town or a village or even more broadly, that they want to have a different type of relationship that's not purely contractual. But maybe if they're trading across vast borders where there's less proximity and the trust mechanisms can't be made, then use contracts and other ways of
that makes sense.
So that's it. I think we've covered it quite well.
I think the only thing I'd just tag in quickly is that, and I'm aware I do constantly come back to this sort of habitat, for want of a better word, but it's like you alluded to it a bit with the psychology. It's an economic lens that he's coming from. I would imagine he doesn't spend a huge amount of time recognizing or drawing attention to just how many ways we are, on a deeply physiological and biological, in a biological sense, extracted from our evolved situation. We've evolved for millions of years in a given situation, and that changes, but in really literal terms, for at least 80,000 years, and it's definitely a lot longer than that. But for evolutionary timescales, we've had a very specific way of operating, and it's only in 10,000 years. I'm repeating myself. I have said this before, but it's only in the last 10,000 years we are, we're analogous to the goldfish in the goldfish bowl versus its natural habitat, and the effects of that are attributable to every single negative we see in modern civilization in terms of Western malaise and social, emotional, psychological sort of defects, familial, social. The whole thing can be attributable to that. And what he's pointing at, the localization thing, is a form of getting back to the habitat instantly. That's what it is. So I think I think it's a really good metric to measure ideal directions to go in, right? And everything I see him doing, and I think he's doing it purely in the economic sense, but because it's built on good foundations, you can then come at it from this entire other perspective and test it by that and go, oh yeah, it does that. The localization thing is heavily a return to the habitat in that sense. The low overhead life is, exactly the same. All these things end up manifesting more of the things which then give rise to these psychological securities and emotional securities and all the rest of it. But then also, even just as the cherry on top, it's not globalized, but something along the lines of what he would envisage in terms of localization. But I would imagine this kind of grid, this kind of a global situation where there are sort of expanded out, more globalized in a healthy sense of the word, ways of people interacting. You're achieving what we all idealize anyway, which is with this localization, with this low overhead life, you're bringing yourself down to an expectation of luxury, which is in keeping for other people to get themselves up to on a global level, whichever country you look at. And that would seem like, oh, you're telling me to lose the things I've gained. Why would I do that? And then they're back to capitalism's great because I get to keep climbing this ladder. But no. The key thing is you're not happy. We're just not. I mean, and it's demonstrable across any metric in society in the West.
Yeah.
And you see it if you travel. You see it in people. Don't get me wrong. I've sat and chatted to that Cambodian granddad, who's living in a shack that would be my shed in my garden, and I'm trying to compute the fact that he's got more happiness in his eyes than than most people I would see back home, right?
Yeah.
You've got to account for that. And yes, he's almost on the poverty line, but we're getting close to that anyway. Here in this side, we're getting all the negatives of the disenfranchisement and estrangement while being close to the poverty line anyway.
But equally, those people are being denied the. Again, intellectual property is a huge barrier. They've been, because everything's inflated, because everything's riddled with these extractive rentier overheads, these people are being denied novel, new, basic technologies that would, I've seen examples, and
you see these people you're talking about, like the people at the poor end of this economic hierarchy, Cambodian granddad on his doorstep.
Yeah. There would be all sorts of, let's just.
I know he's still in that system. He's still been. He's not. I'm not binary. I'm just saying.
But when you're saying about moving up, I think one of the biggest ways in which people talk about neocolonialism and but knowledge and technology is one of the big, as well as finance, as well as the corrupt system of indebting nations and then ongoing extraction and destabilization, further indebtedness. I mean, look what's happening to Ukraine now. I mean, the conditionalities of the law. I mean, anyway, it would be getting off it, but those I would say are the two major mechanisms of keeping the poor. And in particular, the quote unquote developing world. So to kind of open source, if you like, the knowledge, forms of knowledge and the relationship between knowledge and its embeddedness in technology, but then to scale that to their lived experience. So it's not about them then creating massive factories or whatever. It's got more of that Gandhian, and this is about the the Mondragon, the networked production that will just raise their will raise their levels of well-being and material needs, substantially, and would then have them as a partner in advancing that knowledge that can be shared back across. So the principles are really that with the information revolution meant that I know there are costs with the big servers and all the rest of it, but relatively speaking, information travels extremely cheaply. So, globalization of knowledge, globalization of information, hacker collectives that are doing open source design that can then, this huge potential for a commons where the marginal cost of one more unit within that commons is pretty much zero, or as close to zero as you could have.
Yeah.
Well, let's share it. It's like the argument about lights on the street. Everyone gets access to them for no additional marginal cost of production. You can share all that, and then heavy things cost to travel. We know the ecological degradation. So actually, at the sort of material production level, aside from certain, there are certain caveats, rare metals and stuff. It's not there are obviously things that would have to be overcome, but material production can be much, much more localized, much, much more networked. And then you get those, that lack of alienation that comes from that sense of dominion and degrees of control and connection that come with that. Look at health. I just want to try and lay out the extent. Again, it's, there are some very expensive mechanical machines that would still, but nothing that couldn't be, if you extracted a lot of the intellectual property out of that, nothing that couldn't be, pooled resources and bought at a community level.
Especially given the advances in whatever 3D printing is going to be in another 50 years, all the advances that come from having that intellectual property.
Well, exactly. People there's 3D printing and it's a really important example, but, people, it's at risk of being the only thing that's a go-to, and people, you can't 3D print everything or whatever. Yeah. But it's more than that. It's the similar process that happened through the laptop to the production of, journalism, information, media, happening to, you can have the production of medicines, right? If you stripped out that, you could have a little, something the size of a garage probably producing 90% of the core modern medicines that are required, let alone the fact that if we actually did more in health and herbal and, that you could actually solve a lot of that there as well. So,
and again, the exponential advancements that come in the era after that as a result of freeing up all that efficiency.
Exactly. Yeah. So it does go across so many different sectors of human need and health. And then, just one more, around the regulatory capture and so on. Look at land regulation. We've talked about this a lot off air, so to speak, but there's not a shortage of land. There's ways of much more sustainable living that people, I think there's a huge energy and value orientation around that, and it's essentially red taped out of existence by the state. Yeah,
because for what we're talking about before, which is you've got to keep that system ordered in service of the
would disrupt all the investment in the housing industry. I mean, the reason they can't build.
Well, not to mention the happiness of an aristocratic class that wants to maintain its gains, which are mostly represented in land ownership, or largely represented in land ownership.
So I think one of the most just to cap this off, one of the most powerful things about Carson now, you can disagree, or you can disagree as much as you want, but for me, you can disagree at the margins and you can be like, how would this work in detail? But the general principle of the way in which that symbiosis between hierarchical political power and hierarchical economic wealth and the monopoly on the force of violence of the former to support that other system has created such a degree of regulatory capture, forms of barriers to entry, and huge extractions of wealth for a non-productive, non-labouring class. That's why we still work in 7 days a week in some cases. Yeah. That's why people are in debt. That's why people can't pay their energy bills.
And it's really vital to just come back to reality, just to tag on there as well. All of that discussion's been had on the assumption that there is there's a corporate class and a state, and when you've got the level of overlap now and the complete ingratiation of people, the Prime Minister's wife being the biggest investor in whatever pharmaceutical company. So the amount of overlap now, you're struggling to see where one ends and the other one begins, which is technocracy. That's when you've got that fusion of those two worlds.
It's like oligarchic technocracy, isn't it? Yeah, it's like an oligarchy.
And imagine the potency that system has to bring the hammer down beyond any capacity that's ever been had by either one of those structures ever before. Yeah. Some quick critiques, common critiques of Carson's sort of general shtick. Feasibility and transition. One major critique is the practicality of transitioning from the current global capitalist system to the decentralized model Carson advocates. Critics argue that the entrenched interests of corporations and state institutions, coupled with the complexity of modern economies, render such a shift highly improbable without significant disruption or resistance. I actually find that really interesting. I find that I find that an interesting, convincing critique, because rather than it just be attacking, you're naive. It's not all these critiques are usually based on the naivety of the proposition, the narrow sort of frame that's usually being proposed. What I like about that is it's a very pragmatic, wait a minute, these fuckers won't let you do that. That's what that amounts to, right? You've got to, in order to get behind Carson's model, you have to argue for how the existing system couldn't respond and crush it, and it could. And it comes back to the monopoly and violence, the infrastructure that already exists that you've got to somehow grow within. And I think the answer to it is probably in there, growing within. It's kind of something to that, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's what he often.
So he has responded to that on the basis of localized. When you've got. Well, you go.
Yeah, I mean, there's partly the kind of building the new system in the shell of the old, and there's also, I mean, he does draw on, I forget the guy's name, but he was, I think, a Marxist in the 60s, maybe, who was the pioneer of the theory around monopoly capitalism, and essentially drawing on him, Carson believes, and I think, this is debatable, but he talks about the fiscal exhaustion of the state, in that, from an economic sense, it can keep propping up capitalism. But arguably we are seeing that if you think about the bailouts, if you think about, it's sucking, it's producing so much debt in order to maintain the system that eventually it'll just collapse in on itself.
It's already collapsed, in any sensible sense. That's it's on life support. It's a story now that's being maintained.
I just wonder, and again, I don't have the kind of acumen and knowledge to explain how this might work in principle, but I do wonder whether the central bank digital currencies now, similar to the way in which Bretton Woods sort of rebooted the economy, so they shift off the gold and rebooted and somehow kind of breathed new life into financial institutions. I wonder if the sort of central bank digital currency model will in some way address the structural crisis of the financial system, but I don't know how that would work.
At least to an extent that'll pacify people.
And
make civilization make sense again. Because it's not making sense.
No, but I think fundamentally, you're right. Fundamentally, it's you can be really kind of economics 101 about this. It's only when the incentives and the means push enough people, and that will come with a knowledge, in terms of, things are collapsing, but then a pain, feeling this collapse, and then an opportunity space. So it does take pioneers, it does. And also, but as part of the, what I think Carson sees as the fiscal exhaustion of the state loses its capacity to police and regulate these things. You can see that in the intellectual property domain, and whether they find technological solutions that, and then people like VPNs or what, whether the means of sort of subverting the mechanisms of capture, but if you look at, so he actually, I think he might not put it quite like this, or he might, I can't remember his text well enough, but if you look at the quote unquote developing world, the state can't actually, it doesn't have the resources to regulate the system in the way in which Western states do. So you do get forms of anarchy happening more, where and some of that's bad because it's little mafias and all the rest of it, but some of it is people kind of doing what, the kind of their own governance systems for managing this. You get more, there's a guy called Colin Ward that, did a lot around housing, and, we look at favelas, and in some cases, it is really impoverished, but often you will just have poor people, fuck the fucking regulations on land use. We're just using this land now. And to the extent that either there's just too many people doing that, combined with a lack of resources, a clogging up of the legal system, etc., as that collapse is coming, if people believe and agree that it is, there's, you know what I mean? It's kind of working in both ways, and there's tipping points in various different domains, I think.
Technological dependence is another critique. Despite advocating for decentralized and low overhead living, Carson's model may still rely on advanced technology for communication, production, and distribution. Critics question whether this dependence on technology could replicate existing power dynamics or create new forms of dependence and stratification. I feel like his general thing just corrects that, just addresses it.
I think so. I mean, the major one, and at some point he does actually respond to this, and I can't remember exactly what he says, but obviously, and I alluded to it, there are rare minerals, this information economy isn't as immaterial as some of the kind of Silicon Valley zealots or whatever.
What we're not talking about, it can still incorporate methods from the old system. It just needs to put them in the proper place.
Yeah, but then there is a question as to how hegemonic those key, it's like oil. If there is an equivalent to oil, you've got the oil cartel, that manipulate prices, you've got the state formations that grow around those choke points, you've got the military implications of, securing and protecting those. So, there's something in that. But, again, it's like, as far as idealist systems go, and like you say, there's a trajectory, and and then the last one, human nature and cooperation.
Skeptics of Carson's ideas often cite concerns about human nature and the inherent competitiveness and self-interest that might undermine the cooperative and mutualistic ethos he champions. They argue that without some form of central authority or regulation, collective action problems and conflicts could arise, jeopardising the stability and equity of his proposed system. The usual anti-anarchy position, basically, or around that.
And in terms of Carson's direct, writings in response to that, I mean, there's a whole book.
Leaving aside as well the fact that we don't know, I mean, it's the anarchist thing, but I would argue that you can count on human, once you break apart that system and we're back at that localised level and back in that habitat where people don't feel psychologically deranged and want to climb over each other for a buck, the human nature thing will become a corrective factor rather than a problem.
Yeah, well, I think it was Kropotkin, wasn't it, that basically, was challenging the sort of crude or naive reading of Darwin, and showing actually how one of the reasons our species did so well was through
mutuality, reciprocity, collaboration. We'd be nowhere without the collaboration. Is the central order of the day, right?
And so I think human nature arguments for me are kind of, especially of that ilk, are kind of just a dead end to largely, like you say, it depends on the conditions. That then it depends on the institutional conditions. I think also, and again, it's a matter of degree, and then the qualitative changes and the rebalancing of power. I mean, that's really important, because it's not to say there won't be some forms of coordination that in certain respects look like, states.
Yeah.
There will have to be, forms of, probably municipalism. We talked about pooling resources for those higher value technologies, etc. All the stuff that economists talk about in terms of public goods, to the extent that they're actually needed once things are changed. But to the extent they are, there will be those types of systems built. But when the economic power is much more decentralized and much more in the hands of the populace more broadly, then those systems are going to be purely responsive to the genuine needs and desires, not to a rentier class that is essentially driving the state power to prop it up. And then just to say, because it's important, he wrote a whole book called The Desktop Regulatory State, which, it's one guy writing a book. I'm sure there are holes in it, but again, it's a trajectory showing how with this form of platform, we already see things that if you'd have asked the economic theorists, they would have said either we need state regulation or we need a market. It's one or the other. And actually there's a huge array of governance mechanisms, within this kind of peer-to-peer economy that can actually, blockchains, there are new ways of achieving the forms of accreditation and trust that are necessary for the, for exchange and for cooperation more broadly, that don't rely on the old model. Sure, there's probably, different cases where those things don't work, and again, but it comes back to where does the power...
And ultimately as well, you've got my simpler sort of response to that critique is you can't talk about human nature, and it is a moot point, like you were saying, in the sense that you can't talk about human nature and critique what we do or don't do from within a system that inherently compromises and degrades human nature. Like, we don't know how we will act outside of that control paradigm, So a few ways that people can sort of explore or just consider ways to sort of manifest kind of a lot of what would be the solutions based sort of responses to Carson's thinking. You might add more to these, but a few to work with. Things that you can do basically in a solution sense. Participate in or establish a cooperative. Engaging with cooperative business models can offer first-hand experience in decentralized decision-making and economic democracy. It's obviously a little bit light, a bit lukewarm, but it's definitely there. Adopt and promote open source technologies. Embracing open source software and hardware initiatives can help reduce dependence on corporate controlled technologies and foster a culture of sharing and collaboration. So obviously you've got the hacker collectives and everything else we talked about. Explore mutual aid networks. Participating in or forming mutual aid networks within communities can provide practical insights into the benefits and challenges of decentralized support systems. I think that's a little bit more something I'd be interested in, what I've seen demonstrated. Anything that facilitates the kind of reciprocity and mutuality that reminds people, like it usually takes a crisis, right? If there's a crisis, people suddenly realize, I just feel better than I've felt in years, when they're all responding to each other with, we've had the floods around here, anything like that, instantly just draws a line through the sort of the logics of their normal mode of operation. And if you can do that, if you can get people in those collectives having that reciprocity and saying, never mind whether this is a good political idea, I'll just do this for the social effects of it and how good I feel. It's the habitat thing again, Engage in urban gardening and permaculture projects. These practices can serve as entry points into sustainable living and local production, reducing reliance on industrial agriculture and corporate food systems. That kind of crosses over with the other one. Again, it's just, expressions a lot of localization. Experiment with alternative currencies and exchange systems. Utilizing local currencies, time banks or barter systems can offer tangible experiences of economic models outside of mainstream capitalism, aligning with Carson's vision of diversified community-based economies. That's obviously a sort of a building block to any of this stuff. Like, if you want to, you're going to have to play around in the zone of, that's part of the low overhead thing in general and the localism thing in general. But regardless, you've got to experiment with barter systems or something in this emerging sort of crypto domain or whatever. Because as long as there's an increasing, not just maintained, but an increasing level of control over all the means of exchange, and it's getting much since COVID, it's all card payments now, we go in way more in that direction, and it's the sort of thing you can implement instantly. You can start a little, they didn't mention there, but another good one is sort of tool exchanges and stuff like that. People pooling their resources. The amount of people that have got a garage full of equipment that they don't use half the time, you can put that into a local resource and a tool library for people to check things out and things like that. And again, it builds that reciprocity, it builds a satisfying social that feeling of, engaging like that in your community, in a real community, not just one that you're paying lip service to. But all of that with once you put you're localizing value, aren't you? Whether you can do it, if you could make just a percentage of your usual transactions become barter based or local currency based, and then you create increasing efficiencies by the sort of tool thing we're talking about there. All those things, if you add them all up and you keep exploring them, you can end up getting a significant portion of your usual exchange relationships existing in this domain.
In a commons,
in a commons, and in a way that very quickly you could start to see it doesn't take a huge movement in that direction for the system to not be sustainable anymore in its current mode. And a lot of this comes down to as well, you don't have to revolutionize it, you don't have to overthrow it, but just the fact of a pushback and a counter potential that increases your negotiation ability at the table with the elite, right?
Exactly.
The fact that you've got something that where they can't, the more that they can push you, the faster that they can push you, they will. It's human nature. But if you've got something that where they have to negotiate a little bit more shrewdly with you, even just that could be the thing that makes the next 100 years way more palatable for the next 3 generations of your family, you know?
Yeah, everything, like from, I mean, we'll probably talk about some of these in more detail in future episodes, but I think it's, it's come to the point in many people's minds and experiences that much of even what might be seen normally as the sort of more social aspect of the state,
So
it's from healthcare to the social
implications that it offers
to social democratic and to some way, I mean, it's you can view it as placations, but the principle of everyone having access to
placation is just a negotiation. It's that I don't have to be cynical about it. I could just say the appropriate negotiation, the effects that come back as a result of that.
But from access to health, free on the point of entry to, but now
common law.
But common law. Exactly. Educating outside of the school system, everything that otherwise you're like, oh, but I need you for this, and I need you. Do you know what I mean? It's like it creates a disparity in power. So if you've got a lot of the fundamentals in place that give you that security, that because it's like we've talked about, it also comes back to security and fear that that the most kind of ingrained probably worry in our deepest psyche around not being able to eat and feed our families and et cetera. So the more you've got that sorted and the more relationships you've got built as a result of getting that sorted, I mean, that's a huge amount of power. And we mustn't forget that even the welfare state grew out of solidarity networks of workers who were pooling some of their excess salary in order to provide all the things that we now think, oh great, the state will give, enforce us, our employers, to give us sick benefit, sick pay if we're off sick and so on. Well, people actually originally did themselves partly for that negotiate, partly to similar with all sorts of mutual societies that grow around that, and then in a sense that got colonized by a state. And I think if there's a lesson to be drawn, one of the lessons to be drawn from the 20th century is, we then had the kind of neoliberal revolution. We're now potentially moving into, if you like that language, a kind of techno-feudalism. The lesson will be, therefore, that a lot of those gains then got eroded hugely, in terms of people feeling, social security net, job for life, low unemployment, the ability to have your own house and, the security and the power that came with that, the neoliberal revolution from the 80s onwards, and now this kind of techno-feudalism. That's all going to have to be rebuilt, but, based on the fact that it was built through mutualism first, not through a form of statism, and that the state then kind of had to incorporate that and took the legitimacy of that, and then, 30, 40, 50 years later, pulled it away again. I think the lesson has to be that we need to stay in that space, we need to stay in that mutualist space, and I think...
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think, just in closing as well, I'd say, even if, this is minor repetition, but I think it's just maybe an underlining, even if the large-scale political reform wasn't possible, Carson's...
Well, he never advocates for that, I don't think. He never, he doesn't offer a political solution. All he says is, maybe if you're going to vote, we'll vote in the best... just to buy more time to build the...
Yeah, but even just a shift towards a heavily localized sort of, global model kind of thing.
Yeah.
Even if all of it was bullshit, and that actually the only thing that you could achieve out of it is if you got behind the idea that, some of the things we propose might be a good idea for all the social reasons, just to make your life better, just to be connected to your actual community. There's no question that there's very little of substance that formulates real community in the West. Just not really. I mean, religion's probably as much as it's hanging on is about the only thing probably. There's not, when I say of substance, this is arguable obviously, but as soon as you've got real, it comes down to,
I would say the spectacle does,
that's all we've got to unite us now.
Devoid, isolated individuals all consuming the same spectacle and therefore having a sense of...
That's the sort of consensus dream consensus game we're all playing that gives us some actual meaningful interaction with each other. As depressing as that sounds.
And to some extent a biopolitical commitment to each other.
But I'd say a lot in the end. There's a lot of you could talk for half an hour on this, but I'd say what it comes down to is you've got to need other people and they've got to need you. If you can be independent, completely independent and self-sustained and all the rest, within, I don't mean I'm talking about within the parameters handed to you by the current system. It removes you from that reciprocity, from that need, from that social. That it's not just because there's people. No one wants to feel insecure in the sense of they need other people, and as in we recognise that it's not the ideal, but that overlooks the way you feel at people needing you and the reciprocity and the need for the momentum. I mean, this gets to the absolute bedrock of the way we've evolved, what we actually are. So even if all I'm saying is even if all of this stuff was just a good story that could convince people to start exploring some of these ideas, that would have unfathomable gains socially and for happiness and just for general day-to-day satisfaction at people's existence. So there's your big sales pitch. Like the rest of it's a good sales pitch. I don't see a lot to critique in much. Carson's is on the list. I can count on one hand the amount of people that I struggle to find anything. I'm sure there's things there that are beyond my capacity to identify, but I struggle to find anything to critique him on. But even if you put that aside, just using his model as a story to build community and get back to the that kind of habitat sense of how we've actually evolved and what makes us happy as individuals, there's enough reason to do it just for that, surely.